In the mid-1990s, a young man from rural Missouri picked up a phone, called into one of the most listened-to late-night radio shows in America, and calmly told millions of listeners that he had figured out how to break the laws of physics in his own backyard. Then, at the height of the attention that phone call brought him, he disappeared from public view entirely. Years later, he resurfaced on the exact same kind of radio show, telling a story that picked up right where the first one left off. This isn't science fiction. This really happened, on the air, on a real syndicated program, and it's been documented by actual news outlets, not just internet legend. The man's name is Mike Markham, sometimes nicknamed Madman Mike, and his story sits in that strange gray zone between hoax, delusion, and genuine mystery. The kind of story that's stuck around in internet mystery circles for 30 years precisely because nobody has ever fully explained what actually happened to him. Let's go through what's actually documented, what he claims, and why this story refuses to go away. A quick note before we start. It's worth being upfront about something before we get into this. Nothing in this story has been independently verified as scientific fact. No peer-reviewed research confirms any of it. What we do have is a real documented sequence of public radio appearances, a real criminal case and a real gap of several years where the man at the center of the story went quiet. Everything else, whether he actually built a working time machine, comes entirely from his own account. Keep that in mind as we go, because it's exactly what makes this story so interesting. It's not a fabricated internet myth invented out of nothing. It's a real person's real, unverified claim, told twice, years apart, in a way that's never quite added up cleanly to either obvious hoax or complete fabrication. The first call. The story begins in 1995. Mike Markham was 21 years old, living in a small town in Missouri, and by his own account, deeply obsessed with the idea of manipulating time. He described building a device out of salvaged and scavenged parts, transformers, coils, wiring, rigged together into what he called a Jacob's Ladder setup, the kind of arcing high-voltage apparatus you might picture from an old mad scientist film. According to Markham, small tests with this device produced strange results. Objects placed inside would seem to vanish and then reappear moments later, as if they'd briefly slipped out of normal time and snapped back. He took that story to Art Bell's nationally syndicated late-night program Coast to Coast AM, a show that, at its peak, built its entire identity around exactly this kind of story. Unexplained phenomena, government cover-ups, personal accounts of the impossible. I told directly by the people who claim to have experienced them. Markham's account fit right into that world, and it got attention. A young, self-taught tinkerer in the middle of the country, claiming to have stumbled onto something that professional physicists hadn't cracked, using nothing but junkyard parts. But there was a real, unglamorous complication behind the story, and it's the part that grounds this whole saga in actual documented fact, rather than pure legend. Markham needed transformers for his experiments, and according to a police report from the Stanberry Police Department in Missouri, he stole them, specifically from the Joseph Light and Power Generating Station in King City, Missouri. That theft was real. It led to real consequences. Markham served 60 days in jail and was placed on 5 years of probation. This isn't a detail added later for dramatic effect. It's a documented criminal case, confirmed by law enforcement records and later reported on by a Fox affiliate news station. So here's where the story already sits after its first chapter. A real young man with a real criminal record tied directly to his obsession, making an extraordinary and completely unverified claim on a major national platform. That combination, real consequences, unverifiable claim, is exactly the kind of thing that tends to stick in people's memory far longer than a straightforward hoax would. The disappearance. After that initial wave of attention, Markham went quiet. For those following his story through Coast to Coast AM's audience, he effectively vanished. No follow-up interviews, no updates, nothing indicating whether he continued his experiments, given up, or simply moved on with his life after his run-in with the law. In the absence of any real information, the story did what unresolved stories on shows like That One always seem to do. It calcified into legend. Listeners speculated. Some assumed he'd quietly abandoned the whole idea after his arrest. Others, drawn to the more dramatic possibility, wondered whether he'd actually succeeded at something and simply never came back to talk about it. That gap, those years of total silence, is doing a huge amount of work in why this story still gets told today. A story with no ending invites people to write their own. The return. Then, years later, Markham reappeared. This time on Midnight in the Desert, another show hosted by Art Bell after Coast to Coast AM, continuing in that same tradition of late-night paranormal and unexplained phenomena radio. And according to what he told listeners in that appearance, the years in between hadn't been empty at all. Markham said that after his legal trouble, he relocated to Overland Park, Kansas, determined to keep pursuing his time machine project. This time, in his words, the legal way. No more stolen equipment. He described an 18-month stretch of testing, this time using live subjects, hamsters and guinea pigs, sent into the device to see what would happen to a living creature rather than just an inanimate object. By his account, he ran over 200 separate tests, and objects and animals alike would disappear from the device and then reappear again afterward. Then, according to Markham, he decided to test the machine on himself. He told his radio audience that when he stepped into the machine and it activated, he lost consciousness, and when he came to, he was roughly 800 miles from where he'd started, and by his account, 2 years and 2 months had passed since the moment he'd entered the device. In other words, according to his own retelling, the machine hadn't just moved an object a few seconds through time. It had allegedly moved him, physically, both through space and through more than 2 years he couldn't account for. That's the claim, in full, as Markham himself described it on the air years after his first appearance. And it's exactly as unverifiable as it sounds. There's no independent confirmation of the missing 2 years, no documented location data placing him elsewhere during that gap, no scientific measurement of the device, and no peer-reviewed record of any of it. What exists is a man's account of his own experience, told twice on the same kind of platform, separated by a real, unexplained gap in the public record. Why this story refuses to die. Stories like Markham's tend to circulate for one of two reasons. Either they're spectacular enough to be entertaining regardless of truth, or they contain just enough real, checkable detail to keep skeptics and believers arguing with each other indefinitely. Markham's story checks both boxes. The theft, the arrest, the jail time, the probation, those aren't part of the legend. They're a matter of public record that gives the story a foothold in reality that a purely invented myth doesn't have. And that foothold is exactly what makes people take the rest of the claim more seriously than they otherwise might, even though the actual time travel portion of the story rests entirely on one person's word. It's also worth putting Markham's story in context. He's far from the only person to publicly claim some kind of encounter with time travel technology. Stories like this tend to follow a familiar shape: self-taught inventor, garage-built device, junkyard part standing in for a laboratory, a dramatic personal test, and a gap in the timeline that never gets fully explained. Whether that shape reflects something genuinely strange happening to a small number of people, or simply reflects which kinds of stories succeed on shows built around the unexplained, is a question worth asking honestly rather than answering for you. What separates Markham's case from a lot of similar internet-era stories is timing and format. He wasn't posting anonymously on a forum. He wasn't the subject of a viral thread built entirely on secondhand claims. He called into an established national radio program, twice years apart under his own name, and one very real, very documented consequence, his arrest, sits right in the middle of the story, whether the rest of it is true or not. What we actually know versus what we don't. Let's be precise about the line between fact and claim here, because that line matters. What's documented? A man named Mike Markham publicly stated in 1995 that he was building a device intended to manipulate time. He was arrested and convicted for stealing transformers connected to that project, and served real jail time and probation as a result. He appeared again years later on a similar program, describing a continuation of that same project. What's unverified? Everything about whether the device actually worked. The claim that small objects vanished and reappeared. The claim that he tested it on animals over 200 times. And most dramatically, the claim that he personally disappeared for over 2 years and reappeared 800 miles from where he started. No court record, scientific paper, missing persons report, or independent witness account has ever surfaced to confirm that middle stretch of the story, the actual disappearance itself. That absence doesn't prove the story is false. It also doesn't prove it's true. It simply means the entire narrative outside of the arrest rests on one person's own retelling of his own experience, which is precisely the position most stories in this genre eventually end up in. The bigger picture: whatever actually happened to Mike Markham between his 2 radio appearances, his story taps into something that clearly resonates far beyond one late-night broadcast. There's a very old, very human fascination with the idea that an ordinary person, working alone, with nothing but scrap parts and stubbornness, might stumble onto something that professional science hasn't cracked. It's the same appeal behind countless garage inventor legends, and it's part of why stories like this one keep getting reshared, retold, and reinterpreted decades after the original broadcast, even without a single new piece of verified evidence being added to the record. Maybe Markham genuinely believes every word of what he said, shaped by circumstances we don't have full visibility into. Maybe it was, as some who've covered the story have suggested, an elaborate piece of radio folklore, the kind of tale that late-night paranormal programming has always thrived on, whether or not the person telling it fully intends it as fact, or maybe there's a mundane explanation for the missing years that simply never made it into either broadcast. What we're left with is a real name, a real arrest record, 2 real radio appearances separated by an unexplained gap, and a claim about crossing more than 2 years of time that no one has ever been able to confirm or fully debunk. That unresolved middle is exactly why, 30 years later, people are still talking about the man who said he built a time machine, vanished, and came back with a story nobody can quite prove, or quite disprove. What do you think actually happened during those missing years? Let me know your theory in the comments. The 2 phone calls that nobody can fully explain. Strip away every dramatic headline you've seen about this story, and what's actually left is something much stranger than a simple hoax or a simple miracle. 2 phone calls made to the same kind of radio show by the same man years apart that together form a story nobody has ever been able to close the loop on. No confession that it was fake, no confirmation that it was real, just a real arrest record sitting in the middle of an otherwise unprovable claim and a gap of missing years that's never been accounted for. This is the story of Mike Markham, and why, 3 decades later, it's still one of the most argued about did it actually happen stories in the world of unexplained phenomena. Call number 1. In 1995, a 21-year-old from a small town in Missouri called into Art Bell's nationally syndicated overnight program Coast to Coast AM, a show whose entire audience tuned in specifically to hear ordinary people describe extraordinary, unverifiable experiences. Markham told listeners he'd been building a device out of scavenged parts, transformers, and coils wired into a high-voltage rig, and that early tests had produced something bizarre. Small objects placed into the device would seem to briefly vanish, then reappear again moments later, as though they'd slipped out of time and snapped back into place. It's easy to hear that kind of claim and file it away as just another late-night radio story. What keeps this one from fading into the background noise of the genre is the part that isn't a claim at all. It's a documented fact. Markham needed transformers for his experiments, and according to a real police report from the Stanberry Police Department in Missouri, he stole them from a power generating station in King City. That theft happened. It's on record. And it came with real consequences. 60 days in jail, 5 years of probation, later confirmed by a local Fox News affiliate that revisited the story decades on. So even before we get anywhere near the question of time travel, we already have something concrete. A real person with a real name who ended up with an actual criminal record directly tied to his obsession with building this machine. That's an unusual anchor point for a story that otherwise sounds like pure urban legend. The silence in between. After that first call, Markham disappeared from the story entirely. Not necessarily from his own life, but from the narrative that Coast to Coast AM's audience had access to. No updates, no follow-up, nothing to indicate whether he'd kept building, given up after his arrest, or simply moved on and stopped talking about it publicly. For years, that's where the story sat. Unresolved, unfinished, drifting into the background of internet forums and late-night radio folklore. The kind of half-remembered tale people bring up as, wasn't there a guy who said he built a time machine and then just vanished? That silence matters more than it might seem. A story with a clean ending, confirmed hoax, confirmed failure, confirmed anything, tends to get filed away and forgotten. A story that just stops with no resolution at all tends to do the opposite. It keeps getting picked back up, retold, half-remembered, and reshared for years, precisely because there's an obvious gap for people's imagination to fill in. That's exactly what happened here. Call number 2. Then years later, Markham called in again, this time to Midnight in the Desert, a later program also hosted by Art Bell, continuing in the same overnight tradition. And this time, according to what he told the audience, he had an ending to share. He said that after his arrest, he'd relocated to Overland Park, Kansas, and kept working on the project, this time sourcing his equipment legally, rather than repeating the mistake that had landed him in jail. He described roughly 18 months of testing, first on inanimate objects, then on live animals, hamsters and guinea pigs, running more than 200 separate trials, watching them disappear from the device and then reappear again afterward. Convinced the process was safe, he said he decided to step into the machine himself. According to his account, the moment the device activated, he lost consciousness. When he came to, he said he was roughly 800 miles away from where he'd started, and that just over 2 years had passed since he'd stepped inside. 2 years he had no memory of, and no explanation for, other than the machine itself. That's the full claim, exactly as he described it, on the record, on a real broadcast. And it's worth being clear about what it is and isn't. It isn't a court-verified account. It isn't backed by any scientific measurement, any independent witness, or any missing persons documentation confirming those 2 years actually went unaccounted for in any official capacity. It's one man's retelling of his own experience, delivered years after his first appearance, picking up a story that had otherwise gone completely cold. Why this one sticks when so many others don't. Late-night radio has produced thousands of extraordinary personal claims over the decades, alien encounters, government conspiracies, near-death experiences, and yes, plenty of other time travel stories. Most of them fade fast. Markham's has had unusual staying power, and the reason isn't really about how good the story is, it's about how much of it is checkable. Most stories in this genre live entirely in the realm of the unfalsifiable. No names, no records, nothing you could look up, even if you wanted to. Markham's story has a documented arrest sitting right in the middle of it, tied to real property theft from a real utility company, confirmed by an actual police department and reported on by an actual news outlet. That single verified detail does something powerful to the rest of the story. It makes the unverifiable parts feel closer to plausible than they otherwise would, simply because part of the surrounding context turned out to be true. Whether that's a fair leap to make is a different question entirely, but it's clearly the reason this particular story has outlasted so many others just like it. There's also the structure of the story itself, which almost feels engineered for retelling even if it wasn't. A clean beginning, an unexplained gap, and a return with a specific dramatic number attached to it. 800 miles, 2 years and 2 months. Vague claims are easy to forget. Specific, oddly precise numbers like that tend to stick in people's heads and stick around online in a way that a fuzzier account never would. Where this leaves us. Here's the honest state of the evidence, laid out plainly. Confirmed. Markham publicly claimed in 1995 to be building a time manipulation device. Confirmed. He was arrested and convicted for stealing equipment tied to that project and served real jail time. Confirmed. He reappeared years later on a similar program, extending the same narrative. Unconfirmed and likely unconfirmable at this point. Whether the device ever did anything at all, whether the animal testing happened as described, and whether he actually vanished for over 2 years, or whether that stretch of time has a far more ordinary explanation that simply never made it into either broadcast. None of that proves the story is a hoax. None of it proves the story is true. It sits exactly where it's sat for 3 decades. A real name, a real arrest record, and an extraordinary personal claim that no one has ever definitively confirmed or torn apart. And that permanent, unresolved middle ground is exactly why people are still telling this story, arguing about it, and turning it into video after video 30 years after the first phone call. If you had to bet, which way would you lean? Elaborate hoax, honest delusion, or something genuinely unexplained? Let me know your take in the comments.